Hello and welcome to the pharmaphorum podcast. I'm your host, Jonah Comstock. Last month, healthcare leaders and innovators gathered in Amsterdam for the second Health Europe, that's HLTH Europe event. Health always puts on a big show. They're always really interesting, very showy events. And this year, our own Eloise McLennan, our deep dive editor, was on site to hear what folks were talking about, do some interviews. And Eloise is with me to give the health report. And as we go, we're also going to listen to a few of your on-the-ground interviews with folks that you met there.
Hello.
Hello, Eloise.
Well, it's nice to be on this side of the interview for once.
Yeah. Well, I'm excited to hear more about health. We've talked a little bit about it, but, we're saving most of the download to do live on the podcast so all of you can enjoy it. So let's just start with general impressions. This is your first time at a health conference. What did you think? What was it like?
It was indeed. I wasn't sure what to expect because all of my colleagues who have been to the Las Vegas event say it's one of the biggest events of the year, very flashy, very showy, very, very Las Vegas. And I wasn't quite sure how that would translate to a European mindset, but surprisingly, I think that he did quite well. It wasn't too over the top, but at the same time, there was a lot of focus on that interaction between different people. So not necessarily everybody sticking to their own groups that they come with, but there were lots of activities that people could take part in that really got you talking to different people. And aside from that, it was so well decorated with all of these bright green plants that really sort of hammered home the idea of health and of that sort of growth and life that they were also talking about on stage. So it was a really, really interesting place to go to if you go straight off the back of helping with the ASCO coverage, that very scientific focused, and then going into health where it's a lot about those connections and talking about slightly bigger level ideas. So I thought it was an experience. So I was really interested. And they were talking about some of my favorite topics in healthcare at the moment, which we will get into later. Yeah, overall, I was very impressed.
So I know we've gone back and forth on the Vegas event as a publication because we weren't sure how much of a life sciences pharma presence there's been in recent years. From that perspective, was this a good event? Do you see a lot of the folks that we are always looking to see at these events?
So there were a lot of big names. So I saw Novo Nordisk was there. There's a lot of the tech side of the industry. So one of the things that we were listening to quite a lot of was the impact of AI. Now, whether or not there was as much in-depth discussion about AI, I'm not sure. But again, I look at this quite deeply for deep dive. We even have an issue around it, which is coming out later this year. So it was a little bit surface level for my taste, but understanding that everybody there has a different idea. So there were people from Microsoft, from Google. There were also provider pavilions as well. I think that was sponsored by NHS. There were lots of different services. There was a lot of innovative products on display as well, which was quite interesting when you find yourself lying on a fake hospital bed, which has sensors to tell you when to turn. Which is not what I thought I'd be doing when I entered the RAI Center in the center of Amsterdam.
What were the big takeaways about AI? I mean, I think we've definitely reached a saturation point where no one is asking, AI yes or no. It's here. We're figuring out how to deal with it. But I also sense that we're starting to have a little more honesty about its limitations too. What was the conversation like at Health? What did you hear from the folks from Microsoft and Google?
So one of the talks that I found the most interesting was called AI 101, everything you wanted to know but were too afraid to ask. And I think that really sums up kind of where we are in terms of pharma and healthcare with AI. You have some people who know a lot and are really excited, and some people who maybe don't know and are a bit nervous to say they don't know. So you end up with programs that kind of go nowhere. They circle the drain, and it seems like a great idea at the time, but maybe AI was not the most appropriate use of that tool in that space. You're just using AI for the sake of using AI. But one of the things that I heard on that panel was we are at a pivotal moment. How long have we been at a pivotal moment in AI? And there are two options. Are we going down, and you'll like this, Jonah, are we going down the Star Trek route? Or are we going down the Terminator route? Now, the Star Trek route was all of the fancy gizmos and gadgets that you see on various sci-fi TV shows, not just Star Trek. where you'll go into the hospital room, they'll wave an electronic wand over you, identify exactly where you're injured, where you're hurt, and they'll fix it in a heartbeat. And the Terminator one, of course, is the doom and gloom destruction. But one of the things that we heard back in 2016 when we started really talking about AI was that it was going to be the death of all of these jobs, that you weren't going to have radiologists anymore. And the fact is, we are now heading towards 2030, and there's no sign that we're not going to need radiologists anymore. So I think you're absolutely right. One of the biggest conversations was that it's not that two extremes. So we need to find out where the middle ground is. As you mentioned, from Microsoft, there was Elena Bonfiglione. I apologize if I butchered that name. Elena from Microsoft and Susan Thomas from Google were on that AI 101 panel. And they were talking about how AI, as they are working on it, is not being designed to create doctors. They're not sitting in the offices of Google sort of rubbing their hands together and going, oh, how can we get rid of this radiologist? They're looking at how to reshape and reformat the way that doctors spend their time, because they're never going to be able to replicate that human interaction that people need in care settings. You can have sort of robotic arms in surgery, but having a surgeon hold your hand and explain to you what's wrong, talk through what's going to happen to you, that is a very human connection. So it's trying to find how AI can be used to increase those moments of human connection. It's just freeing up clinicians to focus on care, which was really interesting. It's at best, it's kind of, they're seeing it as like a supercharged assistant, but at the same time, we have hallucinations, which we know are a huge problem. We know that AI drift is a problem, especially at scale, but they're looking at it in the same way that we would look at drug development, where you're looking at real safeguards, as in the same way that drugs are safety tested like crazy before they hit the market. AI systems are also looking at those very similar safety regulations, so clinical guardrails, quality management systems, and some continuous validation are what Eleanor and Susan described as non-negotiables in AI and healthcare. As Susan Thomas noted, it's like introducing a new drug. Rigorous safety, education, and that integration, it's fundamental, it has to apply. But I thought when I spoke to people on the ground, there was that idea of care and AI not necessarily being two separate things, but being one thing. And though the way that we care for people who we may not be able to, it can help us identify things quicker. So one of the interviews that we're going to be listening to in a moment from Benedict von Tugen is from Sanome, is about platforms that is used to identify hospital-acquired infection rates faster. And it was inspired by a very touching story of Benedict and his experience with his own father, who unfortunately passed away quite recently, and talking about why that drove him to find those solutions to help people faster. But again, coming from that very human, emotional drive.
Well, let's go ahead and roll that clip, and then we can maybe talk about it a little bit after folks have had a chance to hear it.
Hello, I'm here with Benedict Thum, founder and CEO of Sanome. Great to have you here. If you want to start with the big picture, what was the driving force behind Sanome?
Hey, really good to be here. I lost my father a while back, and clinical teams detected his deterioration too late. And the clinical teams were great, but the challenge is the signal was somewhere in the data. Yeah, so the challenge we have is that data is massively siloed. It's massively complex, and clinical teams are super, super overstretched. And that then leads to clinical teams detecting these deteriorations too late. And it's unfortunately a super, super common problem in healthcare settings. We keep hearing about these stories where people have deteriorations detected too late. So that is ultimately what we're solving at Sanome, is how do we help clinical teams understand their patients better and understand emerging risks. And by surfacing that intelligence to them within their existing workflows, it gives clinical teams the time and the ability to intervene earlier, which is great for a patient, but it's also great financially for the system, because the current healthcare system, we can't keep on going where we are right now.
So do you want to give just a brief overview of what Sanome does in terms of, you're saying that you're bringing these platforms together. As you say, the NHS in particular is massively siloed. everyone has different systems. They're not communicating.
Yeah, absolutely. This has been a really, really cool event because we announced a partnership with East Kent University Hospitals on Monday, and we have real-time access to all data in that NHS trust. So we worked for the last 2 years with patient representatives, privacy providers, ethics boards, etc. And we now have access to all of that data in real time out of multiple different clinical systems. So be that prescription data, clinical notes, image data, etc., etc. And another announcement that I'm also going to share in a second, we translate that data into a risk score that is embedded into the hospital IT system. So it's directly surfaced to give clinical teams the information they need at the right time to say, is something happening to this patient? So let's take an example. Patients in a neuro rehab setting might spend 30 days, 90 days in hospital, and they quite likely to develop a hospital-acquired infection. So let's take pneumonia, which, because if we detect it too late, they may then be transferred to the intensive care unit. Their rehab goes backwards. There's a relatively high mortality rate associated with it, sepsis, complications. So it's terrible for the patient, but also means their length of stay goes longer. So we surface that intelligence and getting them on an antibiotic treatment earlier. The other bit of announcement is we are almost through the regulatory approval with a SCADA comply. So we are going to be a validated software as a medical device, Class 2B, and the European Medical Device Regulation.
That's very exciting.
Yeah.
You've mentioned hospital-acquired infections. Yeah. That's such a huge challenge. You're now expanding pilots into major NHS trusts. What are you hoping to learn from that next phase?
So there's 3 big things that we're now really focusing on over the next 24 months. The first one is in a professional evidence trial, so a randomized control study. We want to show 3 core metrics. So the first one, and the only one really that matters, is clinical adoption. Do clinical teams use and trust the score? And do they do something with it? Then from a clinical outcomes perspective, what we care about are reduced sepsis rates, reduced transfers to ICU. We're looking at reduced mortality, morbidity, and reduced length of stay. We've got a wonderful partnership with East Kent University Hospitals. We've got another wonderful partnership that has been backed by Innovate UK with Royal Devon. And we're now looking to onboard a 3rd NHS site. So we've got a nice mix of different patient populations, different clinical settings, different IT systems. So for us, that core bit is now demonstrating that evidence. The second bit is to then also co-design the next set of algorithms that we want to bring to market. Front runners at the moment are predicting acute kidney injury, predicting thrombosis, but also more like operational things like predicting length of stay,
Working with the NHS can be a really long game. So what's been the key to building sort of strong, productive partnerships so far?
The NHS and any healthcare system for that matter has to be risk averse by design, right? Because we're treating patients, we're ultimately dealing with patient lives. So innovation, whilst that's frustrating as an innovator sometimes, it's all about building trust and fostering that trust. Because, hey, here's a new piece of innovation. And yes, the shiny box may be really, really cool and it could save something, but we're dealing with super, super, super complex system where it's not so, I'm just going to solve sepsis and isn't that great? So many different players. So it's slow and that building that trust level. And it's taken us 2.5 years of just slowly building that trust. And then you go into a new environment. And yes, they will look at other NHS trusts, but they say, hey, my patients are different. We do things slightly differently. And yes, that's frustrating as an innovator, but we've just got to work with that system. And I don't think you can turbocharge innovation because you're going to break something somewhere.
So what's the response been from the people on the ground who will be using these systems?
The biggest learning for us has been if the clinical teams don't know they're using you, then you've done your job, which is actually really bad for you as an innovator because you want people to see your shiny innovation, talk about it. But actually, the success metric for us almost is it's so seamlessly embedded in their workflows. They don't know they're using it, but they're doing something differently, which means they intervene earlier. Or they might double check on the patient earlier. So again, they catch something early. That's success. And that's not what we've got to demonstrate. So bizarrely enough, it's, the hard work is coming from doing really, really close co-design with people at East Kent, people at the Royal Hospital New Disability, people at Devon. Say, how would you use this? Where does it augment your existing clinical pathway? Where in your IT workflows can I surface that intelligence without it being intrusive? So we don't want to disrupt you. We don't want to put more cognitive burden. We actually want to take stuff away.
And is that what separates the real hype that we see around AI from truly impactful products?
AI is just a toolbox to achieve something. At the end of the day, what matters in healthcare, the only thing that matters are the outcomes. Does someone actually use it? Does someone trust it? And are they doing something differently that leads to better patient outcomes or better financial results? That's the only thing that ultimately matters. And did I use AI for that? Did I use a simple spreadsheet for that? Did I use a better UI for that? Does it really matter? So give you a really good example. We have some very early observational data from some of the early evaluation studies we did. And what we saw in that time period was there should have been about 100 transfers to acute care on those 3 wards. That's based on historic data. And ever since we've been working with them, we saw those 100 transfers go down to 3. Now, is it because it was the tool and we were evaluating the tool? Or is it just because people were more cognizant about it and they were washing their hands better or they were communicating better? Does it really matter? Because the outcome was with 97 transfers that didn't happen, it shouldn't have. Everyone's happy. The hospital's happy. The patient's happy. The system's happy. Finance people are happy. We're happy. That's the beauty of healthcare. Did it need AI to achieve that?
Possibly not, but we had it and it was the tool that got us there. Yeah, I completely agree. So looking a bit more broadly, what is exciting you at the moment?
I think what is exciting is what we have managed to pull off with East Kent and Altera, the EPR, is that real-time data flow. So, and it achieves 2 things. The first one is having real-time data means you can build real-world AI applications and get them regulated. Great. But the way more relevant thing is I can now truly evaluate it because I can now drop that model into clinical practice and I can see in real time what is actually changing. Are the prescription behaviors changing? Are we adjusting dosage regimes? Are clinical pathways changing? So you can suddenly generate real world evidence that you've never been able to do before. And that now suddenly fundamentally changes the whole ballpark for, let's take pharma. How do they run their phase 4 evaluation studies where they run a few hundred, maybe a few thousand people, and then they report adverse events and they say, this is my effectiveness data. And you go like, well, not really, because you've massively squeezed it to people like me, white Caucasian males. We don't know if it works on women of Asian descent, but we're kind of extracting it. I'm deliberately black and whiting. It's obviously much more nuanced, much more complex. But because of that real world data now, we can actually truly see it. We do subpopulation analysis, say, hang on a minute, this drug or this treatment, that doesn't seem to be delivering the outcomes for that patient population. And that model is where it's super because when we take that as a feedback loop back into the development of the training of the AI, but more important, like how do you integrate that back into the clinical pathways and how do you drive or support clinical decision making? And that 3-way partnership, we have all those building blocks in place. And that is where I think we're going to see that next massive wave of innovation coming in healthcare. Clinical AI needs that real world evidence piece to demonstrate is actually delivering what the promise is.
We're starting to see it a lot with rare disease, purely because of the smaller patient population.
Yep.
Really difficult to get them into traditional trials, but with digital twins, you can start to get an idea.
Yes.
One question I do have is surrounding the accessibility, because AI as we know it now, it's very expensive.
Yes.
How do we prevent care deserts appearing where hospitals can't afford to implement AI systems, whereas other hospitals can?
Yeah. So a very, very good question. One we've been grappling with at Sanom from a different angle, but with the same result. So the challenge you have with clinical AI is the cost of building it, the compute cost, but also the regulatory cost is so high that it leads to innovators having to charge a lot of money for those solutions. You have innovators that come and say, hey, my solution, I need to charge you £200,000 for it, because otherwise I won't make a return on my development. And some hospitals, the big trusts, say, yeah, cool, we can do that. Others can't, and you end up with these deserts. So when we looked at it and said, that is not scalable. If you want to build 100, 200, 1,000 prediction algorithm, you can't go and ask the hospital trust to pay £10 million, £20 million. So what we as Sanom had to do is say, how can we bring down the cost of developing a clinical AI algorithm by 100 factor of 100? So suddenly, the rough rule of thumb is to build one algorithm is somewhere between £5 and £10 million. What we have done is brought down that cost by 100x. So suddenly we don't have to charge that much for an algorithm so that we still make profit.
Yeah.
Now, suddenly I can go to a smaller rural trust that may be in deficit, but most of them are in deficit, and say, hey, I only need to charge you PK and we still make money. It's better for them. The other bit, I would like to move to value-based care model, where I give you the algorithm for free for the next 6 months. We pre-agree 3 outcome measures. Mm-hmm. So let's say length of stay, ICU transfers, productivity, but make it up. And we will demonstrate in those 6 months savings. If there are no savings, you don't pay us anything. If there are, I want 20% of those savings.
Okay, my final question for you today is, we hear so many buzzwords, so many myths and misinformation flying around. If you could snap your fingers and dispel one myth around AI and around digital twins, what would it be and why?
Wow, what a question. Dispel one myth.
Is it going to erase all doctors and nurses by the year 2030?
No, not at all. And I'm just trying to think what would be a really good answer. AI, there's two things that happen in healthcare, right? So the majority of people that go into clinical care is because people want to care. They want to provide care. They want to hold the hand of a patient. They want to tell them in a time of need that it's going to be okay, but in really strong emotional connection. The other side is patient, when they go into a healthcare setting, they fundamentally want to be understood. They want to know whatever is wrong with them, the doctor, the nurse, the care provider understands them and their uniqueness. So those are the two things: understand, the need to understand and the need to care. That is so fundamentally human that AI cannot take that away. It can support the understanding, it can support the decision making, but they cannot care. AI cannot care. So that human touch of putting your hand on someone else's hand, it's going to be okay, AI can't replace it. But what we can do is all of the administrative burden work ambient AI is doing, or that decision burden, understanding we can take that away to basically free our healthcare providers to be more human. And I think I don't know if it's a myth or something that needs to be dispelled, but I think we need to realize that AI is always going to be a supporting tool, not a replacement tool.
Well, thank you very much for speaking to me, Benedict. It's been really interesting to hear from you.
So I think you set that up really well, Eloise. But just now that we can sort of reference it more specifically, why did you think that was kind of a good example? Just summed up sort of some of what you were hearing about AI at the conference.
Oh, because it's such an expensive problem. Hospital-acquired infections are so expensive for healthcare systems around the world. If you can have a small piece of software that integrates with EHRs that can identify those risks early on, you can then create earlier interventions, which, apart from saving lives, saves a lot of money. Looking at the NHS in particular, that is no small feat, and it's something that we struggle with quite a lot is how to make the NHS financially sustainable. And those little interventions make a big difference. But it's also a case of ensuring that we have the infrastructure. And it's because it's quite a small addition in terms of you're not going to need a giant machine to come in. You're not going to have to rebuild the entire hospital. It's an incremental change that can help to streamline what clinicians, what nurses are doing on a day-to-day basis, but also give them a wider view over their patients.
It gets at this notion that I think we hear a lot from the folks who are really on the ground, which is that AI should be not a solution in search of a problem. It should be, deployed like a scalpel to actually improve efficiency in the areas where efficiency needs to be improved. And so I think it's a really good example of, an use case, that's really like targeted and making a difference.
I completely agree. I think we've seen in many instances where people will come up with an idea that creates a problem rather than solving a problem that already exists using AI. But because you want to be seen as using AI, because that is the latest sort of in vogue notion for healthcare at the moment, you would bulldozer rather, as Benedict says, scalpel. And I think those scalpel sort of deployments of AI are where we're probably going to see the most impact. It will be smaller incremental changes that add up to larger reshapings of the way that we actually approach healthcare.
So getting into that notion of impact and ROI, that was another topic that I wanted to ask about is where are we seeing the value of this? How are we measuring the value of this? Not just AI necessarily, but all the technology we're talking about here in digital health tools and things like that, patient engagement.
Well, this is where it gets really interesting because when we're talking about sort of VC investment into AI tools, you're not necessarily going to see that immediate ROI that you see elsewhere. Because as we talk about those incremental changes, they take time to create an impact. And you might bring in an AI tool or a software, piece of software that makes that efficiency change within a hospital ward, within a pharmaceutical company. That's not going to give you immediate return on interest. But over time, what it will do is improve the speed of which you can react. It improves your efficiency. It improves the effectiveness in the way that you can go about your work. And that, over a couple of years, will give you results. But it's making the case for investors to look beyond that year. So we're looking at sort of 2, 3, 5 years that's when you're really going to see the biggest impact. And that was really something that was spoken about. There was a panel that Eugene Brockovich, our old friend Eugene, moderated, and it was talking about whether or not partnerships within digital were not necessarily a good idea, but how they can be approached. They talked quite extensively about the obsession with AI. And Martin Peters, I think he was from Novartis, Martin Peters, was arguing that we should follow on those long-term contributions to health outcomes rather than looking, as I said, on those much shorter sighted immediate returns. Because digital tools, he said, aren't magic. They're part of a broader engagement strategy. The one thing we also need to talk about is the fact that they help, or looking at digital tools, digital patient support tools as well, help patients to improve their adherence rates. So you're getting patients to stay on your drug longer, which again, you're not going to see overnight. You're very rarely going to see overnight returns on that, but it will hopefully have an impact 2 or 3 years down the line. And David Klein from Click Therapeutics was also on that panel, and he was talking about how we've seen that in the world of the drugs plus software market.
That's really interesting because that's something I've been hearing the last few years at conferences like DTX, or Digital Therapeutics, where just purely from an economic standpoint, that's where pharma sees enough value from these things to actually move the needle and be interested, is adherence and patient management, because it has that multiplicative effect, right? Where however many patients you have on this blockbuster drug, that you're going to increase that by some percent of folks who are actually refilling, actually taking. And then actually at Axtria event that Nicole and I were at recently, Greg Myers from BMS said something about how he thinks the future of drugs, they're all going to be prescribed with a wraparound therapeutic, that leverages AI and sort of gives people that support to know kind of when and how to take it and everything. So it's definitely neat to hear that as we go to these different conferences around the world, we're hearing some of the same things, right?
Absolutely. And there's a point that I want to touch on later on in the podcast, but that's particularly important around GLP-1s at the moment. But we will come back to that later, because that was a really important thing that we
Because first we have another interview we want to set up, right? So talk to me a little bit about Fiona.
So Fiona Costello from Brain Plus. This I thought was a particularly interesting idea. So it's talking about digitizing CST for dementia. Now, if you don't know what CST is, hang on, let me just double check my notes because I don't want to get it wrong. It's cognitive stimulation therapy. So the thing that I thought that was when I first heard about it, I thought it was electrodes, like you were electrically stimulating someone's brain, but it's nothing to do with that. It is a digital tool to help understand how you can support dementia patients. And there are many, many ideas surrounding this, but again, it comes from a very, very personal space. We talk about dementia care particularly quite a lot recently in terms of dementia and Alzheimer's. There are so many ideas for how we can help treat, but what can we do for the patients who are going through it now? And so what it does is it works with, again, this is in the UK, it's a nice recommended, the cognitive stimulation therapy, and they have a digital platform called Ayla. What it is it's a clinically evidenced non-drug therapy that's said to delay cognitive decline by 4 to 6 months. Now, I'll let Fiona herself explain a little bit more, because she will do a far better job than I will. Hello, I'm here with Fiona Costello, who is SVP Partnerships at Brain Plus. Dementia care is a deeply personal, emotional space. So what first drew you to this work?
Well, I think dementia is something that affects everybody. In one way or another, it's believed that it's going to affect 1 in 2 of us. You only have to look at the statistics to understand the breadth and depth of the challenge that we have. For me personally, both my grandmothers had dementia. They do refer to it as the women's disease. Women are more predisposed to getting dementia. So I think it's a personal experience, a lived experience of watching someone you love be there but not there. And what drew me to Brain Plus was a very cool mission, a different conversation about how we use psychosocial therapy to support people with dementia with really tangible positive outcomes. And I think for me and many of the team, we just couldn't believe that more people had heard of cognitive stimulation.
Now, let's talk about cognitive stimulation therapy. And I'm glad you said it first because I was going to stumble over the pronunciation. It's clinically proven, widely recommended, and yet still relatively, as you say, not well known, kind of underused. What's been the biggest barrier to scaling CST until now?
So I think it's fair to say, so as you've rightly pointed out, CST has a really strong academic background. It's 20 years of research, study after study after study. However, I think there have been challenges in how that's bridged into operational delivery. So in terms of the challenges, we have workforce challenges in terms of how do you have the optimal workforce to deliver cognitive stimulation therapy. It's also a very analog therapy at the moment. So by that, I mean that you can go and receive 1 day's training in CST, and then you will get given a manual, and it will be up to you as a facilitator to interpret that manual depending on the severity of dementia, depending on the mobility requirements, the decade of birth. And when you're starting to look at the different dynamics of individuals, that becomes really challenging, I think, to interpret that evidence and that guidance into real world settings.
I think just for those of you who may not know what cognitive stimulation therapy is, can you just explain what it is and how it works in relation to dementia?
Yeah, the cognitive stimulation therapy is a multimodal group therapy. So it uses a range of different therapeutic interventions to deliver a group-based activity format. It's largely language-based. Delivering 2 sessions a week for 7 weeks is what we refer to as the initial CST program. And if you deliver these sessions, which can be on a variety of topics, so one of them is physical games, another might be current affairs, and the last one is quizzes. If you deliver 2 sessions a week for 7 weeks, you can achieve a delayed cognitive decline of 4 to 6 months.
6 months?
4 to 6 months, which makes it really interesting because you will know that when you start to look at the drugs that are not getting recommended by NICE, for example, the actual benefit of these drugs from a delayed cognitive decline are very similar.
So Brain Plus has is it Isla? Can you explain what that is?
So Isla is a digital platform. It essentially has digitized that CST manual. So you as a facilitator or someone that's trained in CST can go on, and depending on the dynamics of the group that you're going to be facilitating, whether they're mild or moderate or a combination of both, you can basically do a plug and play therapeutic program, which takes out some of that pain in terms of how do you make the activities appropriate for your individuals who are participating in the group. What we've done at Isla is we've digitized that format, created 14 sessions, and in those sessions there are 180 clinically validated activities that are known to draw on these different techniques to stimulate different parts of the brain to achieve that cognitive impact.
It's been described as customizable and very person-centered. How important is that element of personalization in dementia care, and how do you deliver that in practice?
I think when we're talking about customization and personalization for people with dementia, I think it comes back to some really fundamental core principles of what it is to be human, which is your individual experience, your own life experience, your cultural background, how you've related to the world over decades. What we've done is basically taken that core premise to develop a range of activities that then a facilitator can use their judgment to curate for that individual and for that group. Obviously, personalization only goes so far in a group format, but what we've done is we've enabled, so for example, in a session, you will be given a choice of 3 different activities, and then you will work with the group to identify which activity they want to do as a collective. And again, the different questions that we ask, the different prompts that we use encourages people to participate, encourages people to reflect, to remember.
But it also gives them their own agency because they are actively helping to decide what is best for them.
Absolutely. And I think as we envisage getting older, we don't want to be robbed of some of these these core human characteristics, which is I want to do what I want to do. And I think it's observing of that. And it's just a deeply respectful way to preserve someone's dignity at a time when they may feel like their dignity is being compromised by this terrible disease.
And it must be very, very scary as well. So having that idea of control gives you as you said, some sort of agency and feeling like you have a hand in your treatment.
Absolutely. I think that for people with dementia, I think there's still quite a lot of stigma attached to dementia. I was in Southwest England for the launch of a dementia strategy event, and lots of people living on their own, rural populations, very proud people who are waiting until absolute crisis point because they are so frightened to engage. They don't want to go down that road of a dementia diagnosis because of the fear of the unknown. And I think in that respect, we're on a bit of a journey in the same way with mental health, which is how do we enable people to have the space to have the conversations and to learn about what different options are available to them.
Now, one of the biggest plus points for ILET is scalability.
Yes.
As you say, it's digitized. Digital products are much easier to ship over than a printed out pamphlet of 150 pages. So how do you see Brain Plus fitting into the future of dementia care, especially as we've got aging populations and demand will be growing for these services?
So I think where I think it's particularly exciting, so at the moment we're very much focused on how do we support care home providers to deliver cognitive stimulation therapy to residents. But we also know that in the UK, certainly, there is this, again, fear about going to a care home. And in different countries, they don't have that same environment. So the idea is that at the point, from a future perspective, at the point that someone starts to think, I may have mild cognitive impairments, I may be at the very beginning of that journey, that they are aware of CST, that they know how to access CST. Our plans are to create a platform that enables people to identify where they can access CST close to them. And then as we find these new diagnostics, like the blood testing, as we find new biomarkers, that we're able to introduce this as a complement to these existing pharmacological interventions that are coming through the pipeline. I don't think it's a case of either or, but rather a case of how do we work together to enable the best possible impact.
And talking about delivering that at scale, one of the things that you need is the ecosystem in place to be able to deliver it. So what are some of the key partnerships that you need to make that scale up happen? Are you working, you mentioned care homes, are you working with health systems? Are there any other players that are involved?
Yeah, so I think community voluntary sector providers who are delivering services to the elderly. We've got partnerships, emerging partnerships with discussions with the NHS and specifically in their memory services and equivalents. We work with municipalities in Denmark, so local authorities who are responsible for delivering services to elderly people. And it's really about what's another beautiful thing about cognitive stimulation therapy is you just as an individual need 1 day's training in order to be able to deliver it. So when we think about some of the resource challenges that exist in healthcare systems, we can start to unlock that. You know, there's a huge variety of people that can support with the delivery of cognitive stimulation therapy, including families and including carers, that goes above and beyond sort of traditional institutions.
And what's the response been like? I'm particularly interested in what the response has been like from patients themselves.
So the patients have been, as you would imagine with a new intervention, initially quite resistant, a little bit, I don't see the point of this, quite despondent. However, last week we were doing a CST session in a care home and this person, they weren't responding very well. They were a bit disengaged. And then as the images on the platform were going through, he sits up and he's like, I remember I really liked swimming. It's these sorts of prompts and it stimulates these different parts of it. And how powerful is that? How powerful is it to have someone with dementia say, I remember, when they're probably in a world where they're just constantly being told they've forgotten something?
That's really interesting. And what's the response been from the care home side of things? They found it easy to implement? Is it been a bit of a learning curve?
So we have a very handheld approach to the implementation. We spend time to identify the right cohort of people who would potentially be interested, thinking about group dynamics and how individuals might interact with each other. We take them through the platform, we go through it with them, but it's been designed deliberately to be intuitive and easy to use. We tell them how they can edit sessions. So if they've got a group activity with a whole group of moderate dementia, they may think actually going through a choice of 3 activities might be too overwhelming. So I'm going to make it 2 choices. So they can customize it. They're still using their breadth and depth of knowledge of their patients and residents in order to be able to tailor it, but they've got those prompts that make that activity all the more engaging and meaningful.
Is there anything that surprised you in pursuing this?
I think for me, what's the most surprising thing is that more people haven't heard about cognitive stimulation therapy. I think the awareness is a really important part of the story, and raising people's understanding and awareness of cognitive stimulation therapy, what it potentially means, its comparison to drugs in particular, and, and when they work together, what can we achieve? But also, to your earlier point, thinking about the ongoing challenge of dementia and how we as a population evolve, and thinking
what is the ultimate
social
goal
treatment
for brain health and Isla, do you think? And where do you see yourself in the next 3 to 5 years? Do you have any specific goals that you're looking to hit? What does success look like for you personally?
So we are very much positioning ourselves as the world's first scalable dementia care platform that is built on cognitive stimulation therapy. So over the next 2 or 3 years, our primary objective is to get into as many care homes as possible in order to be able to enable them to achieve the benefits of cognitive stimulation therapy and to improve the quality of life of residents. And there's so much academic research, including 3 papers published this year, that shows that CST has a direct impact on quality of life like no other intervention. So we are really wanting to harness that academic energy, harness that belief and that positivity around CST to make it more known in care home settings. We also want to continue to expand the provision within healthcare services to ensure that it's an integral part of the pathway. And our ambition is to then think, how does that bridge earlier in the pathway? So thinking about the journey of cognitive decline, how do we start to engage with people at the point of mild cognitive impairment? But if you're a woman and you're starting to hit menopause, how does that journey impact cognitive impairment? How do we start to develop interventions and approaches that really look at that life cycle of cognitive decline?
Any kind of wrap-up thoughts about Brain Plus before we start talking about GLP-1s?
I think one of the big things that we've all talked about is scalability, and preparing CST is a big barrier to delivery. So I think that it could be an interesting one to see in terms of whether or not patients will actually be able to access. But I definitely think, looking, as we were talking about the digital tools that go alongside the pharmacological interventions, are a really interesting place to start looking, because we talk about drug development. Drug development takes 10 years, 90% fails. How can we help patients on the ground within the next 5 years? I think that's a particularly important place to also be looking.
Great, yeah. And I mean, it's like, as you say, it's not either or.
Absolutely not.
As we develop these digital tools, it's going to enhance the effectiveness of these drugs, hopefully.
Yeah.
Yeah. It's interesting to also be talking about that in a space like neuro, in a condition like dementia. We sometimes think about digital tools as being something like young people are more equipped with, but we're talking about, this is something that's going to work for an aging population too.
Don't forget that aging population will eventually, within the next 30 years, have been born with technology. So yes, you're likely to encounter some levels of technology sort of literacy. But I think as we progress and the older generations become more technologically knowledgeable, that's going to be less and less of an issue, because you'll have that foundation knowledge there.
Yeah. Let's talk GLP-1s.
My favorite.
Yeah. So you mentioned that Novo Nordisk was there, or?
Yeah. So speaking of digital tools, Novo Nordisk was also there to announce a new digital tool themselves, which was to accompany their semaglutide products, the GLP-1 products, because one of the things that they found, and this was also spoken about in quite an aptly named Shrinking Snobbery panel, if I could speak correctly. I think it was Scott Honkin, who is Chief Commercial Officer of Weight Watchers, was also talking about this, is that adherence rates in GLP-1s are sort of notoriously poor compared to the number of people. We're really good at getting people onto GLP-1s. That's been the focus so far. But how do you know do you titrate people? When do you bring people off of that drug? If people don't make any sort of lifestyle changes alongside of it and they come off, they're going to ultimately return to that previous weight, most likely, because it's not a silver bullet. So they were talking about launching a digital tool to run alongside their pharmacological products, because they've seen a need for those interventions or those intervention points along the treatment pathway. So not just being given your medication, you go away for months. You may have really severe gastrointestinal side effects. You don't take your drugs. It's a really strange space because if you were given, and this was also mentioned during that panel, if you were given heart medication, you wouldn't take it for 3 months and think, oh, my heart feels better now, I'm going to stop taking it. But we do have, unfortunately, that cultural mindset around any drug that has a weight loss side effect. And
Right.
I think we need to get on top of really conveying that it's a prescription medication and it needs to be given that level of respect. And one of the ways of helping to reinforce that is to have the digital companion side of things. So patients are still checking in. They have that element of control as well. But yeah, it was all about talking about being at a turning point in the way that we view obesity. Very limited discussion on the diabetes aspect, which I thought was quite interesting. A lot more discussion surrounding obesity and weight loss, which, given the popularity of that discussion in sort of cultural aspects right now, cultural settings, it does make a lot of sense.
Yeah, I think it's newer and it's in some ways kind of more interesting. A lot of the big cultural questions around GLP-1s are related to the obesity. I actually moderated this panel on GLP-1s at Bio, and we were talking almost exclusively about obesity.
Yeah, and it was the setting for, or the sort of the topic of some of the best discussions that I had just with people that I met at the event, whether it was speaking to representatives from Newman who were there, VPs themselves, members from Novo Nordisk. It was really interesting to hear that perception from each different area that they were working in. Because I think that it's such a delicate subject at the moment. You get so many people who are on GLP-1s who will not talk about the fact that they're on GLP-1s. So that also eats into how much you can do surrounding education if no one will talk about it. And then that also has a knock-on effect for adherence, because if you don't have that level of community, then you are less likely to continue to take your medication as instructed. And that was actually a conversation that I had with Scott Honker, who there will be more videos coming out, but he was a very, very interesting interview subject. That will be a video, I believe, coming out soon. But the other real talking point was cost, because the cost of these drugs are so high. If patients have to pay out of pocket for them and then don't make the lifestyle changes, they are losing thousands and gaining very, very little. And there's like 60 plus GLP-1s in the pipeline at the moment. Again, similar to the digital health tools and to digital support tools, that return on investment doesn't start to kick in 2-3 years, because helping somebody lose weight has an impact on their personal health. However, the return on investment that we talk about in terms of reduced strain on the health system, people being able to be in work longer, having to take fewer sick days, having fewer health problems, those don't tend to kick in for 2 to 3 years. So again, it's how do you keep that interest and investment and the payers happy if you don't have that return, that ROI, until much later than they're used to having in the cycle.
So we're getting close to time here. This is going to be a monster podcast with all of the clips, but we've got one more that we want to put in. So I think, do you want to set up the interview with Nick a little bit and talk a little bit about what you heard in terms of investment and also around kind of this equity stuff, and then we can listen to that and then we can sort of wrap up.
Absolutely. So one of the things that Eugene Brokovich was talking about was buzzwords. One of his questions to the panel was, what is one buzzword that you would like to get rid of immediately? And speaking to our next interviewee, who is Nick Ross, he's a co-founder of Invest in Equity, there are so many buzzwords. There are so many buzzwords. 2 of them I heard other people mention were equity and women's health, not because they didn't think they were important, but because they didn't think they got the attention after the buzzword was mentioned. So we've been to many a conference when you have the women's health panel is the last thing that you hear on the last day when everyone's exhausted, everyone's gone home. That's where it's always put. Something that I was talking to Nick Ross about was, how do you get women's health and equitable health and diverse health investment? And it starts with having a diverse investment team. So this interview is discussing particularly getting women into investment rooms, but also the kinds of investments that they make and how that can actually have a much, much better impact on global health if we have those more diverse teams. Now, I know that diversity, equity is all sort of getting a bit taboo at the moment, but it's a very, very important conversation to have. I do hope you enjoy this conversation I have with Nick Ross. Hello, and I'm here with Nick Ross, who is the co-founder of Invest in Equity. Nick.
Hi, Eloise. Thanks for having me on.
So what inspired the development and creation of Invest in Equity?
And so for Steph and I, two of the co-founders, we've been sat on the outside working with investors over the last 5 years. What's very clear to see is that there is a lack of a meritocracy within the investment space and a lack of opportunity for women to be recognised, but they should be at the partner and managing partner level. And I think it's really clear to see when you look at where capital is deployed and how that's impacting human health. And actually, when we thought about how to have a real impact on the ecosystem and the industry as a whole, we have the network and you have access to the people to create a demonstrable change within this group by creating more diverse investment teams. We've got this ability to have a trickle-down effect onto the industry.
And there's plenty of data linking diverse teams to better outcomes. So why do you think that message is still taking time to land within life science investment?
I think when we, as an industry, and there are some really positive changes. So we look to board representation is now far better than it ever has been. We looked at the number of women coming in as graduates. Actually, there's now more women coming into the industry than there are men. Where we really lack, and if I think to it specifically to the investment side, is the investment industry is one that is built on network and access. Women don't have that. They're fighting for access rather than naturally being given the space. What we found, the more we talk to people about it, the more we talk to senior figures, both men and women, there's many allies that want to get involved and contribute. They often just don't know what the first step is.
Are we still seeing the old classic of deals being made on the golf course?
I think that's still very much the harsh reality. Deals are being done in rooms where women don't have access, not a case of being rooms that are built based on merit.
Invest in Equity combines mentorship, allyship, and training. So can you give us a sense of how that's working so far and the kind of response you've seen in the 4 weeks that you've been going?
So I think first and foremost, we've had brilliant partners join us. So Health being one and giving us the stage here and being able to talk about the platform. To the BIA, who are keen to, we're running events with across the course of this year, who are supporting us and championing us throughout the UK ecosystem. And then also Covington, who, significant legal firm, are trying to create spaces for us to have these discussions and sit in the right rooms. When I think to your question on how we start making more change, and the real positives that came out in the first 4 weeks of what we're doing, is the desire for people to take part, the desire for people to be allies. I was expecting more cynicism, I was expecting more reluctance, and really the only really significant piece of feedback we'd be given is make sure this has impact. So our first starting point is actually collecting the data from the space. So we're closing off a survey at the end of this month, which will give us that focus for the next 12. The consistent theme does tend to be in 3 areas. One, access to LPs, so that in the future they can raise their own funds, which is often that step between principal partner through to a managing partner. 2, that they are mentors, and those mentors act like champions at the same time, that they open doors, that they create spaces for people to come into. And finally, we see a part here as being a real central connector to the rest of the industry as a whole and raising the profile of investors. Because actually change here isn't going to come from just investors operating differently. It's also going to operate with executives with the power in industry to open the doors, to champion the women that they work with, to recognize the excellence that they've got in front of them. And those are really going to be starting points, the foundation of the organization.
So I spoke a little bit about starting points, but let's talk about measuring success. So 4 weeks in, obviously going to have the short-term goals of getting your name out there and how do you plan to measure success in the long term, not just for Invest in Equity, but the wider VC ecosystem?
So I think there's multiple markers within that. One will be that women are paid correctly for their level and their title and their responsibility. Now, we are not going to be the sole organization responsible for this change. This has to come in lots of different forms and formats. What we can do is collect data that's very individual to life sciences and recognize whether that momentum is changing, whether we are making progress. But we can start to see partners, male and female, getting equal share of the rewards for their efforts. That would be a very good demonstrable marker that we're having in that. An ability for women to have a career in the investment space, which I think is often the challenge, that personal drivers are not facilitated in the investment space. It's not a world that currently tolerates diversity. It doesn't allow for family life, personal life, along with your professional life. And I think there's a lot that we can do there to support larger funds in particular in creating structures that enable women to have long-term careers.
So are you focusing on making sure that women can have a wide array of investments and not just be pigeonholed into one space?
Most of the investors that we work with look at very diverse groups of investment. Now, a lot of female managing partners are forced to get creative in how they raise their funds, which is often that they're converting into impact funds, or they're finding their capital in different places in order to raise funds, but they cannot raise them to the same size and scale. If I told you it's a $120 million fund is the largest fund focused on women's health, that's as big as it gets. And that is not good enough. That is where we have real opportunity challenge. But we also fundamentally believe we've got more diverse investment teams, they will invest more diversely. The data supports all of those arguments. Those lived experiences make us realize where opportunities are, and that ability to pivot opportunities into commercial opportunities, venture opportunities.
So you mentioned the panels from yesterday.
Yeah.
One of the things you spoke about was smarter investments. Now, can you give us a bit of an idea of what smarter looks like when equity is part of the equation?
And in the early stage space in particular, collaboration and partnership is actually a phenomenal tool when you think about the investment space in general, but it's also a really powerful way for people to operate in quite a smart manner and build funds of size and scale. Eli, an individual who works with Angels and a number of other investment firms across the US and UK and Europe, talked about how it's critical that 10 million, 20 million, 30 million funds combine together to drive businesses forward. It also enables, when you think to larger funds with lots of angels in, you can create a much more unbiased view, but you put a much bigger range of investors exploring opportunities. So collaboration, partnership, that spirit and mindset is really how we can get created to take full advantage of what is currently quite a dispersed set of resources.
Now, you mentioned a moment ago the idea of people wanting to get involved but not knowing what to do. What do you think is one small but meaningful step that people can take towards supporting equity and investment?
I think the easiest and most simple is start having conversations about it. Have it, and that shouldn't be a conversation that features once a year at an AGM. It needs to be week in, week out about how we make sure that our organizations enable people purely on a merit basis progress through their careers. I also think fundamentally when you come to recruit, give thought to where else you can find sources of talent. Our industry, and I think to some degree I can understand from a practical business perspective of someone's looking to bring in a partner, they go to the person they know. And if you go to the person you know, you typically end up with a homogeneous group of individuals. And actually we need to break that cycle. Look in other places, ask for support to bring other people in, tap into a diverse market. Don't presume that the person you know is the best person for the job. And the rhetoric we're very careful with is, this isn't a doom and gloom scenario. This is actually, there's opportunity galore for everyone in front of us. If we can make it a more diverse environment, if we can make these changes, organizations will accelerate. Your ROI and your investments will likely improve. There's all these pathways. If I put myself in the shoes of an investor, I'm incredibly busy. I need fast, high confidence solutions to everything that I approach. And so I go to my known instincts. I go to the things I trust because it's straightforward and it's easier. And I think a lot of this is often it's not a case of don't reach out to the man about syndicating for a deal. It's about when you think about an opportunity, reach out to a man and a woman. Ask 2 questions instead of 1. Make a little bit more effort to create that change of conversation. And syndication is a really clear opportunity for us to bring more people to the table, more opportunities. And the long term, if men fail to realize it, women are going to hold a lot of power and a lot of capital to deploy. There is an opportunity here for people to raise bigger funds, to deploy more capital, to get investment there for their portfolio that are looking to grow. And that's what I hope anyone who's thinking about it realizes is an opportunity, not a threat.
Well, I look forward to seeing how that develops. Thank you so much for joining me.
Well, that was really interesting, and I think, as you said before the clip started, Eloise, like it is important we keep having these conversations about equity, and I would at least hope that an event in Europe wouldn't be too quelled by what's happening in the United States around the discussion of some of this stuff.
It is also still an American event. You have a lot of American companies, a lot of American speakers. So it wasn't far from everybody's minds. But at the same time, I think everybody at the event sees or saw and understands how important it is to make sure that the treatments that we offer, the innovations that we come up with, and the technology that we develop is not just centered around small hubs. Because when we talk about equity, we're not just talking about different levels of financial success. You're talking about people who live in rural communities who may not have access to one hospital but still need the same treatments.
What I enjoyed about Nick's comments in your conversation with him was just how concrete it was. He wasn't just, talking about platitudes. He was saying, this is what you can do to make sure that you're not missing these investments and that, you're supporting all different kinds of innovators. So I hope that landed as well with our audience as it did with me. But there's the kinds of conversations that I think it's really good to come to these events for. I mean, you were talking about, Eugene, and about buzzwords versus reality. And I think some of that real nitty gritty is what we want, what we want to hear.
Exactly.
And it sounds like that was kind of the big theme for you out of this conference. Is that right?
Yeah, completely. So I do think it comes a little bit with just being around people who were having conversations and you just, as an outsider, want to say, but how? So hearing we need to make these drugs available for everybody. Okay, what's the first step? And I think what was really nice about, as you said, that conversation with Nick was that I asked him, what's the first step? And he gave me a very clear answer, which you don't often get in healthcare, which was quite nice. But I think it speaks to him understanding that there is a challenge and that they have developed a path to try and create a solution. And I think that was something that I definitely wanted to hear from. You don't often get a group of people from Microsoft and Google in a room that you get to ask questions to. I do just hope that when they go away from those events, that they start thinking about those first steps and that it isn't just surface level conversations, that there are moments in time where they're going to put in those first steps. Because we can all talk about 20 years, 30 years. I can make hypotheses for what is going to happen in healthcare in 30 years. But if you are in a position where you can make decisions to get us towards those 30 years, I would like to hope that you were actually putting that foundation in place.
Excellent. And a great note to end on. So thank you so much for taking the time to talk to me about this, Eloise. For those of you who are listening, and for those of you who are listening and want to hear more, the full videos are going to be on our website, pharmaphorum.com/videos. There's more videos from health, plus a lot of videos from bio that I did. Still more to come from ASCO that our colleague Nicole did. It's a great way to kind of catch up on these events if you weren't able to attend, or even if you were there, because there's so much happening. So I'd very much encourage you to check out our website, our YouTube channel, and hear more from these experts who we got to hear from on this show.
Yes, and while I'm here, I will also plug the latest deep dive edition, which will be coming out soon, which is the oncology edition. We also have the AI edition coming out later this year. And a new topic coming for us this year is the equity and sustainability issue. So I'm excited for that one.
Very apropos to our discussion. Thank you again, and thank you all for listening. Yeah, hope you're getting through this conference season with your sanity intact as much as our team is.
And that concludes another episode of the pharmaphorum podcast. You can find more information about this episode, including a download link and information about previous installments at pharmaphorum.com/podcasts. The pharmaphorum podcast is also available on Apple Podcasts, Spotify, Overcast, Pocket Casts, Podbean, and pretty much wherever else you download your other podcasts from. Just search for pharmaphorum and follow and hit subscribe. Of course, don't forget to visit our website itself, where you can sign up for daily and weekly news and analysis bulletins. And do follow us on Blue Sky and LinkedIn at pharmaphorum. That's all for now. Thank you for listening.